Hello and welcome to the Groupthink Podcast. Joining us today is Sam Lively, a teacher and the author of The Trojan Mouse, How Disney is Winning the Culture War. How's it going, man?
Doing well. How are you doing, Tyler?
Well, I'm doing well considering we're surviving the apocalypse one day at a time, but...
Hey, it works out when you're a teacher. You just get to stay home. I'm on an eternal spring break right now.
Well, that's one way to handle it. I do IT for conferences, so there's nothing happening right now in the world of conferences. So my entire crew is just sitting around a warehouse getting cabin fever. So Plot of the Shining is going to start happening any day now.
There we go. Yeah, they'll have to rename coronavirus cabin fever at this rate.
Oh gosh, it's terrible. I can tell you half the warehouse is just sitting there like, yeah, I'll take the layoff at this point. I just don't want to kill my other employees, but
Indeed.
But yeah, so first off, tell us a little about yourself and your book.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a screenwriting teacher and former adjunct professor back in California. I briefly worked at Universal and then got burnt out with the kind of hours and roles that they had available for young, struggling screenwriter types. So I ended up pivoting to the academic side as well as nonprofit stuff. But I never lost the urge or the fire that pushed me to be involved in the first place. So my mind has always engaged critically with storytelling and movies in particular. So I zeroed in on Disney, grew up being heavily influenced by Disney, and sort of brought a culture war perspective to a history of Disney that I thought was very important, especially for Christian and conservatives and parents of young kids in particular, who view Disney as a great option for family-friendly entertainment, but might not understand some of the deeper mythological components to Disney that could actually, I think, shape the minds and values. Yeah, I can just keep on going forever, but I figure I talked too long on that intro, so.
No, it's fine. I guess my first question is, what was it like being conservative and Christian and working at Universal? I mean, because everyone I ever hear says you don't get work if you're either of those things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't get good work. I got bottom of the barrel work. It was the bottom rungs of Hollywood are very brutal. It's such a high demand to get in that there's very little people won't do. And so as a result, if you're starting a family and you're trying to have some semblance of a normal life outside of the business, it's very unforgiving. So being a Christian and conservative in Hollywood, you're pretty much incognito with those kind of things, because the most powerful people that you're trying to impress climb that ladder don't want to hear that. So when politics come up, you just kind of get silent and look the other way. Or when faith gets discussed, I mean, it's difficult. Some people were probably more successful than I was in maintaining a witness and being more outspoken. But for me, I was just trying to seize any kind of advantage to move ahead. And it's not the kind of thing that you want to advertise if you're trying to impress the movers and shakers in the business.
I was gonna say, I've met some people that are able to bottle it up, but then you meet that one guy who just can't shut up about it. And I mean, like, yeah, that guy's not gonna get far. That guy's not gonna get very far. But I mean, I did.
And unfortunately, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I did. I went to school for sound effects editing, and I did that and boom operating for about 2 years after I graduated. And I never even got to the part where I could do anything past an internship because it was so competitive out of Chicago, because you get thousands and thousands of students coming out of Columbia every year, or however many, I don't even know. Mm-hmm. But you get all these students coming out of Columbia every year, and they all flood into the audio internships and the union jobs, and you might get like one hire out of the entire lot, because those studios are like it's like 3 people, and they don't want to hire anyone, so they just hire out internships, and then they kick them all out after 3 months. So it's
Yeah.
brutal, and I didn't even have the opportunity to say any of my opinions, let alone even get
Well,
a job. So
anytime you have a glamour industry that rewards people with a liberal arts kind of bent, it's going to be hyper competitive. I guess in your case too, it's sound effects editing. Usually that's the tech side. You've got some level of cover ideologically, because most people aren't asking you. Narrative kind of, because that's usually what's most zealously guarded.
well, it's all there's a huge number of people going into it too. So it's not just that it's competitive in a creative sense. It's that you have to actually kind of worm your way into it through your networking and your influences. It's like everything else in Hollywood. It's nonstop nepotism and networking.
Yeah,
It's really all there is to it. You really can't. Yeah, that's the only way you get in.
And you got to tip your hat to the people that are able to persevere and get through. It's just unfortunate that the direction that people typically have to bend is away from Christianity and conservatism and towards at least nominal progressive nihilism. I mean, it's a tough place to survive and thrive in without changing, at least superficially.
Ironically, the only person in my college class who got hired within like a year of graduating school was a lesbian woman, and she got hired because she was bilingual. So
okay.
you only got hired if you had that kind of super competitive edge where you could I can work with the Spanish market, good. And she was like the only one. They might have been like one other person, but
yeah.
But yeah, let's talk more about your book. So what is it? I haven't had time to page through it seriously yet. So can you kind of give us the elevator pitch and?
Yeah, it's the idea of the Trojan Mouse is this idea that Disney is something that is very appealing and non-threatening in its initial appearance on the horizon. But when it actually gets ushered into your living room, it is host to a number of worldviews and narratives that shape worldviews that are going to be distinctly progressive in the modern sense of the word. I use the term revolutionary because it's really something that is trying to overthrow or upend values that have been held dear in American culture for hundreds of years. So it's the Trojan Mouse, and it's much more effective than some of the more direct assaults or obvious propaganda that's out there in the entertainment world, because it is so friendly, because it is so winsome. And as a result, people are going to embrace it. They're going to let their kids watch it for hour upon hour. And over time, the stories that are contained in there can actually shift people's values in a very significant way. So that 10 years after being brought up partly by Disney, they're going to be believing and valuing things that are quite different than what their parents did at the same ages. So the Trojan Mouse, yeah, that's the idea. It's an ideological history of Disney from its beginnings as a pretty conservative institution to its fall after Walt's death, and then its renaissance and revival from the 80s to today, and that's where you see the big ideological shifts occur. In the 80s, when the management shifted into Hollywood hands, into traditional Hollywood hands, and it became a vehicle for introducing some very highly charged political and moral ideologies into what had been a pretty conservative family-friendly space.
Sure, and I kind of want to go back and forth on a couple of points I'm not clear on, just because
Sure.
I get the sense you and I tend to have I tend to have a slightly more optimistic opinion based on some of our discourse on Twitter, just in terms of our attitudes about Hollywood. I mean, well, for starters, like, I mean, just as a general question for you, like, what brought you to art in general? Then, if you generally think Hollywood is trying to push these things, like, did you think you could change? What did you want to bring into it?
Well, I just wanted to tell stories. I was a storyteller, but I believe stories are fundamentally value charged. Every story is putting the storyteller in God's seat, essentially deciding what's good and evil in the world, who the heroes are, who the villains are, cause and effect chains that determine what kind of behavior gets rewarded, what kind of behavior gets punished. So I think any storyteller is going to have a worldview that's going to be reflected in their story. And so as a storyteller, I wanted to tell stories that advanced my worldview, right? Coming from a Christian conservative perspective, I wanted to tell stories that celebrated the heroes and the villains of my mythology. And so approaching modern Hollywood, I see storytellers who are often very gifted, often have very moving things to say, but they have fundamentally different values. And I think that people who are like me, who want to raise their children in to share their values and to share their beliefs, would be concerned to find out that a lot of the stories that they're consuming are positioning things differently. They're doing a different definition of good and evil, that are shifting the definitions of heroism and villainy, and creating different kinds of causes and effects than what their worldview would be predicting. So I mean, stories are going to be all across the map, but in general, I think if you look at Disney's latest, the last 30 plus years of their body of work, you're going to see stories that are subtly pushing heroes and villains and themes that start to advance a political and an ideological set of ideas that are going to be very deeply in conflict with what we would define as Christian and conservative ideas.
I don't think I disagree with any of that necessarily. I definitely think that there is the bent you see in Disney films is there, and I don't know where I would say it necessarily begins, because obviously in the 90s there was a mild feminist bend to the films, but it was never serious.
Right.
It's very watered down in the 90s, at least by the standards of modern progressivism. But
well, it's I take a more contrarian look at some of those early ones. But if you want to start, I mean, if you want to dig in, the Renaissance, and that's where most people start getting interested in Disney again, because like you have the classics, everybody loves Snow White and Pinocchio, and then you have the Dark Ages in the late 60s and 70s and early 80s, when you have things that people just sort of pretend didn't happen, like Black Cauldron, and or on the live action side, movies like Dragon Slayer and The Black Hole, which are just, I mean, they're some of them are pretty amazingly bad. But the Renaissance, the Disney Renaissance, begins with it takes off with The Little Mermaid, and so The Little Mermaid, I think, is a good starting point for people who are first considering how Disney might push ideologies, because it's really torn between the two worlds. Are you pretty familiar with Little Mermaid?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've seen all the classic Disney films. I had all the clamshells growing up, so.
Well, think about if you think about the development of Little Mermaid. Little Mermaid it was Jeffrey Katzenberg was the creative executive over animation. Technically, Roy Disney was in charge, but it was Katzenberg who was bringing the energy, hiring in new people to try to breathe some life back into Disney animation. So he brought in a guy named Howard Ashman, a brilliant songwriter and playwright from Broadway, and then along with him Peter Schneider, another Broadway executive, and then there would be more after them. But generally, what the Ashman moment meant for Disney was a shift from sort of cutesy animation to something that had a little bit more of an edge. and it had a positive energy too. I mean, those Broadway numbers, you can see if you watch Little Mermaid and then watch something like Great Mouse Detective, the energy is just remarkably different, even though they're only a few years apart in time. And so Ashman brought a Broadway energy and a Broadway aesthetic, but he also brought the beginnings of a Broadway value system. And you can start to see that battle between a traditional Disney and a new progressive Disney in Little Mermaid. And you can see it in the characters of Triton and Ursula, with Ariel sort of caught in between. So Triton is your standard patriarchal, conservative authority figure of the past, right? Super authoritative, white bearded, I mean, almost like this divine figure, right? The old order. And then you have, against him, you have Ursula. And this is, a lot of people don't know this, but Ursula was actually drawn after Divine, the drag queen, who was big on the East Coast. In Ashman, I think Ashman knew Divine personally. So this idea of this sort of liberated, garish, sort of cabaret kind of singer against this old patriarchal authority figure, and both of them are fighting over the heart of Ariel. And so Ariel, of course, betrays her father to some extent to pursue the love of her life, and hopes that this Ursula character, Sea Witch, is going to be able to make her dreams come true. And that is a sort of a preview of what's going to happen in the rest of the Renaissance. Now, Little Mermaid ends up very conservative because Ariel is making a mistake defying tradition, even though she has a legitimate grievance. It is a huge mistake to defy tradition and embrace this Sea Witch. And it leads to a tragedy, and her father having to do sort of almost like this Christ-like sacrifice to restore order and save her from the devil's bargain she struck. So Little Mermaid is this, you can see it as this microcosm of an ideological battle that's starting to happen in Disney storytelling. And I think it's really the last of the truly conservative Disney movies as a result. Because after Ashman got established, after that Broadway aesthetic got popularized, after Little Mermaid became a huge hit, there was an energy that came out of it to where new voices, progressive voices, were going to now push Disney further and further into this worldview of liberation, of self-actualization, of libertinism, and a pushback, a rejection, and even a villainization of traditional values, of paternal authority, and traditional ideas of good and evil, of civilization instead of primitivism. All these kind of ideas that we can now see in woke discourse, you can start to see percolating in early Disney. So, I mean, I remember, I believe you know Faith Moore on Twitter.
Yeah, I had her on my show, so.
Yeah, she has some really interesting thoughts on this as well. But we discussed Beauty and the Beast, and she saw a lot of good things in Beauty and the Beast, and I agree with that. But I think you can also see a lot of the beginnings of the woke doctrine in sort of a foundation laid in Beauty and the Beast, even though it still feels and looks very traditional. It actually has quite a revolutionary foundation at its base. Are you familiar with Linda Wolverton?
I am not.
Linda Wolverton is the screenwriter who joined Howard Ashman. It was another Katzenberg recruit. So Katzenberg found Linda Wolverton, was just a playwright who he brought her in because he wanted her voice in Disney storytelling. And so she wrote the Beauty and the Beast script, working with Ashman's songs and sort of creative energy. And Wolverton, as you'll see in future films that she did, is a very intentional feminist revolutionary. She wasn't able to do to the full extent what she wanted to in Beauty and the Beast. It's still very conventional in a lot of ways, but you can see a lot of the themes that will be capitalized on later. the villainization of the masculine, right? The toxic masculinity of Gaston, and even the toxic masculinity of the Beast. I mean, the Beast is a caricature of excessive of male excess, and so you have the beginnings here of a feminist pushback, but by no means would it just be a feminist pushback. After Beating Beast, we also see in Aladdin, we see a takedown of of a lot of these traditional views of good and evil and self-sacrifice, right? With a whole new world, the huge hit anthem from Aladdin. There's an explicit rejection of traditional authority and an embrace of following your heart, of belief in the teenage heart as the ultimate moral compass. And that's very different. That's very different from traditional Disney. Again, we who grew up watching these kind of movies don't necessarily see that as a break from old Disney. But if you compare the message of Jasmine and Aladdin, rejecting parental authority, saying no one to tell us no or where to go, right? Instead, embracing this idea of sort of completely libertinistic pleasure seeking. And then contrast that with what Snow White and Cinderella and Pinocchio had to go through in their arcs, right? But none of those were self-actualization. Those are all anti-self-actualization to a certain degree. It was all about humility, about self-sacrifice, about dependence on grace, and a restoration of tradition, not a break with tradition to embrace this whole new world. So you can see that again in early form in Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast, and that sort of civil war that we saw in Little Mermaid. And then you start to see it take off after that. Some of the more naked ideological movies of that era were Tarzan, Pocahontas, Hunchback of Notre Dame, all very, very explicit in taking on sort of symbols of the old order and subverting them. So you have in Pocahontas, it takes the new world, old world dichotomy and it flips it, right? So instead of John Smith coming in as a civilizer and a bearer of the Christian message, right? I mean, Pocahontas literally became a Christian. Instead, it's reversed, and John Smith instead becomes an odd observer of a sort of pagan spirituality and a convert to Pocahontas's way of looking at things. And the invading colonists, right, are become the villains who have to be driven out of this very pure, virginal pagan world that is depicted as superior to the Christian world of the West. So Pocahontas took a pretty strong line there. You can also see in Hunchback of Notre Dame with Esmeralda when she takes on she becomes sort of the proto social justice warrior who takes on the evil, not clergyman. They actually shifted Frollo from a clergyman, but a sort of a representative of prudishness and piety. And she does her little stripper pole dance, as a resistance to his attempt to slap everyone down with his traditional morality. And so it turns Hunchback of Notre Dame into a story of a struggle of the libertine minority against the religious moral majority, so called, and turns it into an overthrow of that church authority, with Frollo cast essentially into hell, and Esmeralda leading the gypsies out into the light, out of the church and into the light, into this whole new future. And then finally with Tarzan, which is sort of the pinnacle of Disney Renaissance, or not pinnacle, sorry, the nightcap of the Disney Renaissance. Tarzan takes the original and very racist original Tarzan story and flips it into a very aggressively woke kind of. Again, this is pre-woke. I mean, the term woke didn't even apply back then, but a lot of the early seeds are there. You can see in Tarzan how Tarzan is, instead of being a man who has conquered nature, he is actually a sort of a champion of nature against other men. And so he finds his ultimate redemption by stripping off his civilized clothes in the final act and becoming an ape, identifying with his ape father, and throwing out the civilized invaders, and then getting this girl to cast off civilization as well and join him in this sort of Belle Sauvage state in the jungle. So all that being a sort of a whirlwind tour of the ideological threads of Disney Renaissance, all of them united in challenging traditional values, and pushing people into instead this sort of libertinistic way of thinking, of viewing the world, and an idea of reversing every hierarchy, right? Let's smash the patriarchy, castigate the first world, put nature over man, not man over nature, and all these kind of things that you get and see what we would now refer to as things like environmentalism and feminism. We can actually see in story form in those early Disney Renaissance movies.
Okay, I mean that leads me to my first point of contention. Where do you think
Sure.
what do you think the source of this is coming from? Because my general frame of understanding Hollywood is that it's generally kind of a battle between the artist and the talent, and most of the time the artist is generally a progressive person, and the money side of things, and then the other side of things is the money, where they have to worry about the bottom line, and they know for a fact that you can only sell so much of this to the public before they start to get upset, or they start not going to the movies as you see a certain amounts of it. So to a certain degree, a lot of progressive themes you see in Disney films tends to get stamped down or watered down to a point where it's tolerable to the average person who's not terribly interested in it one way or the other. So do you think that for the most part this is Disney just falling in line with their artists, or what they see as external pressure, or a corporation pushing this from internally without? Do you think this is the artist side or the corporate side?
This was the artist side, but with corporate facilitation, I'd say. Again, if you think when '80s, the big ideological shift happened right after Disney's son-in-law, Ron Miller, got booted for mismanaging the company, and he was just sort of coasting on Walt's old narrative impulses from 15, 20 years previous. So you got a very conservative bent corporately that was then in artists that were encouraged to follow that sort of conservative bent, including some conservative artists. Don Bluth, right? John Lasseter has a sort of conservative angle. A lot of the people who were attracted to Disney actually had fairly conservative outlooks. But once Eisner and Katzenberg and Frank Wells take over in the mid-'80s, they begin attracting and cultivating talent that is distinctly progressive in voice. So again, that's why. So it's the artists, it's the Howard Ashmans, it's the Linda Wolvertons, the people who are actually coming up with content, who are pushing the narrative. But they could only do that because they were recruited and encouraged and fostered by a corporate culture that was distinctly progressive and revolutionary in its ethics. I mean, Jeffrey Katzenberg was very strong in his personal ideology. He was more of just a corporate guy in terms of just trying to make good money in a lot of his decisions. But whenever he had somebody to recruit, he would universally recruit people who shared his ideological bent. And as a result, that synergy between corporate having a strong progressive bias, and then bringing in all these artists who really wanted to tell. And Linda Wolverton will just straight up say it. I mean, she really wanted to smash the patriarchy. She wanted to completely change the idea of a Disney heroine from the ones that she had grown up with. So you end up with a lot of artists who have sort of a grievance with old Disney, a grievance with traditional American culture, and start viewing this American icon of Disney as a chance to redress those wrongs, as a chance to rewrite the American script from one of heteronormative patriarchy to something that's more free-spirited, more liberal, more embracing of the heart and the self as the ultimate compass, as opposed to the traditional morals of the old Disney universe. So yeah, I think it's just what happens when you have a big corporate shakeup, and the new corporation has completely different tastes, different values, and end up bringing in people who want to use those values. Artists tend to be much more grievance or emotionally driven than corporate guys. But as long as they can do it in a way that's pleasing to the corporation, and I think those artists, Ashman and Wolverton, are excellent artisans. They were able to both please the corporate, the suits that were running things with very successful products, but they were also very successful in pushing forward their own personal worldview and making that the Disney worldview, which then trickles down to all the consumers, all the people who are watching Aladdin on repeat like 4 times a day, like I did when I was a kid, end up with remarkable shifts, I think, in the way they view things, right? I mean, look at Aladdin. Aladdin is a thief who never repents, never really. In fact, his big problem is trying to go straight, trying to be legit, when his whole appeal was in being this sort of devil-may-care bad boy who was going to take Jasmine places that the traditional court could never do. So that had an enormous influence, I think, on everybody who grew up watching those movies. And it changes your sympathies when you start to see other real life circumstances where there's a charismatic sort of Robin Hood kind of figure who's willing to steal from the rich to give to the poor. You're going to automatically sympathize with them because those are heroes of your own childhood. And I think that's had an enormous impact on the culture, in that all the people who grew up on Disney are essentially programmed to be more sympathetic to a lot of the progressive causes of the day, and to view the conservative counterattacks as from the wrong side, right? As from the enemy, from the villains. And again, even if you've been raised to value different things, that emotional coding is still very powerful, and it can lead people, even if they don't believe in some of the things that are being pushed today, they tend to be silent because, again, that instinctive sympathy for the opposing side that I think has been heavily influenced by movies like the Disney Renaissance ones.
I mean, Disney does tamp it down a little bit, though, because, I mean, when I see progressive critics like Lindsay Ellis or Bob Chipman, people who hate capitalism but love going to movies, like, the one thing that they constantly bring up when it comes to Disney is that they're horribly inauthentic with their wokeness, because they're the true believers, and they see Disney as like, well, you're pandering to us, but we know you don't want the revolution to come. You want a version of the revolution where Disney still exists, and
right, Disney's
not going to exist in the new revolutionary world because Disney is a monopolistic, all-powerful corporation. And so,
but there's that's where that's where the Great Awakening comes in. The Great Awakening was because yes, there is a fundamental disconnect there. There's a tension between a capitalist corporation and a revolutionary social justice ethic. But that's where the Great Awakening comes in. Shortly after, remember, when the recession in 2008, there was a big like a backlash against big corporations, including media. But what the shift that happened after that was corporations taking on the social requests of the revolutionary left and embracing those and then divesting them from the economic ones. So, and this is consistent with what Disney's done since the Renaissance, is not really challenging any sort of economic capitalist frameworks other than a few moments, and instead focusing on the cultural side of the issue. So it really is a culture war now, whereas in the past it was both a cultural and a political war. Now it's really about the values, not necessarily the economic systems behind those values, but the actual values that that separate right and left, conservative, progressive, whatever terms you use to demarcate the culture war. So post 2009, you really see a corporate shift where they get the revolutionary left, for the most part, to stop trying to overthrow big business, because big business is on their side on the social and cultural battleground issues. So that's when you see feminism, multiculturalism, sexual revolutionaryism, all these kind of things become corporate stamped approval, right? And you've got and really the best symbol of it is the rainbow flag. I mean, I know the rainbow flag is used mainly for LGBTQ stuff, but I think it's a pretty good symbol of the new corporate left initiative, which is we will accept all grievances, right, except economic ones. So it's like if you have a problem with someone, with your dad, right? If you have a problem with men, if you have a problem with heteronormative culture, if you have a problem with the Western civilization, right, versus non-Western civilizations, then yes, corporations will back you on that. And in return, basically the truce is that those people then will not try to attack multinational corporations' right to exist. And so you can see that now. You can see that being very successful, and that even though there are leftist critics who carp at businesses like Disney, for the most part, they are not. For the most part, they are not that influential, and the vast majority, I think, of the revolutionary framework continues to move forward hand in hand with large media corporations who are happy to make that bargain, right? Let us continue to grow and acquire new businesses and become more and more dominant, and we will let you dominate the cultural sphere, and we'll let you fight the old Christian culture warriors and shut them up in return for not taking on the political Marxist stuff and trying to take out big businesses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think you're starting to see that kind of button up against the progressive movement, because obviously now there's the massive split in the party between the Biden-esque corporate left and the Sanders-esque Marxist left, where they actually do see people that are on the left that are like, this is inauthentic, this is against what we've been standing for the past 20 years, we need to actually rip up the corporations yesterday, and it's not, I don't think that status quo can last forever.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to get my phone charger. Yeah, I totally see what you're saying. The idea of this coalition of the fringes holding together is something that especially the people on the right have been hoping for. They've been hoping that eventually this alliance, which has been very powerful in changing the culture, is going to break apart. But I don't know. I mean, look who's winning. Biden is winning, even with a pretty conventional sort of left-center approach. But at the same time, you can see the more revolutionary side is winning, because look at what Biden is advocating. Biden is advocating a lot of the stuff that would have been considered extreme in the past. You know, I think we're going to see more restrictions on free speech in the future if Biden were to win. More of the pet causes of the cultural progressives being adopted by this center-left figure. I think you saw the same thing with with Hillary when she was running, and that very much a creature of the old Washington establishment when it came to economic and foreign policy, but when it came to cultural issues, cultural battleground issues, virtually the entire left is now firmly in the what used to be considered the extreme left culturally. So social issues have become very polarized, and the corporations, I think, have seen it as sort of the bargain, right? Let's become very much to the left socially because it's not going to impact the bottom line, and in return, the activists have mostly fallen in line. I mean, you do get the rebellions on the fringe, but I don't think they've had any success in getting people to change the economic orientation of their leadership.
Sure. So, what do you think? Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second there.
No.
To what degree do you think that it's selling now that people tend to people are generally fighting back against it? Because now there's obviously the huge coalition of people online that are very sensitive to progressive themes in films, and they're widespread boycotting things. They're widespread bringing attention to some. And there was the whole Ghostbusters thing, and then there's massive campaigns about Captain Marvel and Star Wars and all these things. Like, to what degree is the progressive message even going to be financially viable in the future?
Yeah, well, it's difficult especially for those on Twitter. We can feel like there's more awareness than there actually is, and I feel like the polls have been there's wokeness on both sides now, right? There's the left is woke to the power structures of the old guard trying to take back over, and the right, the conservative side is woke to the progressive dominance of new media and big corporations. But the middle is still very normal, and they're not necessarily catching on to these polls of social media in the way that those of us who are very much online are. And I think that there is where a lot of the damage is being done, in the middle. The good old Overton window, right? The discussion, the pop culture discussion. So even as certain movies become more and more open, less subtle in their propaganda, like the Captain Marvel movie, they're still having a pretty big effect on the middle of the country that is not getting their consumption, their entertainment consumption, commented on and filtered by culture warriors on either side. And you see that. I mean, you see that with I know Ghostbusters kind of tanked, but Captain Marvel was a huge hit, no?
Yeah, I think that was, but that also had the benefit of being tied directly into of Infinity War and Endgame. So. Right.
And if you look at the end of Endgame too, I mean, you can see a lot of the. My feel on Marvel is that it's so postmodern, and actually has a hard time being putting together a coherent worldview because it's so much. There's so much going on that it ceases to serve as a traditional myth in the way that it codes for values and beliefs. But if you look at the end of Endgame, they had several moments where they were trying to sort of push the sort of corporate woke sentiment, right? You had the all women brigade, at the end that went into charge, and you had sort of the passing of the baton to a new, diverse, inclusive future, right? That was putting aside the old dominance of the straight white man. So it's I think as they do get more open about it, and people will listen more to the culture warriors like me on the right saying, hey, these people are trying to change your mind. But to the degree that they continue to stay in mainstream pop culture vehicles, they will have a pretty big impact. And they need those people, the people in the middle have to be reached out other than just on Twitter, with people going into community institutions and sort of spreading the word on how entertainment consumption can ultimately drive worldview formation, and that people become essentially what they eat online and in theaters and on TV. So the battle is not over. It's not over just because it's becoming more open. It's just moving into a more escalating phase where people on both sides are going to get more triggered by the reactions and the counter reactions. But the people in the middle are very much still vulnerable, I think, to being swayed to one side or the other.
All right. I mean, that's all the questions I had for you in regards to the topic, but I appreciate your time, and I'll give this book one more shout out. The Trojan Mouse: How Disney is Winning the Culture War. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Tyler. I had a good time talking to you.
Sure. Do you want to have anything you want to end on, or do you have any last thoughts?
Well, I mean, just if people are looking for the book, it's on Amazon, and I also put these things out on Twitter called Disney Dossiers that are just sort of graphic infographics on some of the newer releases in particular that expose it from a Christian conservative side what sort of the good is, what the bad is, and what some discussion points are. So I put those out on Twitter for anybody who doesn't want to read a book but would like to see some infographics, sort of giving that perspective on the movies. That would be a good place to go. Can
you say your Twitter handle real quick?
Yeah, it's at Samuel P. Lively on Twitter.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I thank you for coming on. So,
thanks, Tyler.
Have a good night.
You too.